I wish a warm evening to our chief guests, members of Think India, and our participants. And I welcome you all to the book launch and conversation on Indian Muslim and Women's Movement by Zakia Soman. I extend my warm welcome to Ms. Zakia Soman for today's discussion. Ms. Zakia, who is a women's rights activist from India and one of the founding members of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, she used to be a university professor of business communication in English at the University of Gujarat. She heads the Peace and Human Security Theme in Action Aid. She is a member of South Asian Alliance for Poverty Eradication, which engages with the issues of excluded communities regionally. Ma'am works and writes on issues of peace and justice, secularism, human rights, minority rights, and rights of Muslim women. Her articles advocating rights of Muslim women and tolerance and harmony with other communities are published in various Indian publications. She has edited a book on Dalit Muslims and a volume on peace and justice in South Asia. We welcome you, ma'am. I also like to welcome Ms. Divyanshu, who is a student of law at NLU Sonipat, for hosting today's discussion. Before proceeding, I request all the audience to keep their microphones muted and cameras off during the discussion, and we may have to remove those participants who do not adhere to the notified rule. A Q&A session will be organized at the end of the session. Please ask the question through the chat box at that time only. Now, I would like to hand over Ms. Zakia and Mr. Vyach.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. Indian Muslim Women's Movement is a collection of articles and essays that capture the beginning of Muslim women's movement in India. It's about journey of Muslim women demanding reforms in Muslim family law and equal citizenship without any discrimination. Based on experiences and insights from grounded struggles for ordinary women, these essays give hope and provide strength in addressing discrimination through shared vision and collective democratic action. Thank you, ma'am, for providing us with such a masterpiece. So, ma'am, we all know that it was the Gujarat riots of 2002 that changed your life and made you a social activist. You started working for peace, relief, and rehabilitation, and to heal the protracted trauma of the collective psyche. And then you campaigned on quota cases, whereby 300 innocent boys were put in jail and cooked up charges. But how and when you realized that Muslim women need to be empowered? Is there any specific incident that made you feel that Muslim women need to fight the patriarchy and feudal forces within their own community? Over to you, ma'am.
Hi Divyanshi, and hi everybody at Think India. Namaste and Adab. Thanks for this opportunity given to me. Divyanshi has raised a very important question that, when is it that one transcends from being a regular person, a normal person, an ordinary person into something else, So yeah, I guess my moment of reckoning came when there were riots in Gujarat in 2002. I'm sure most of you must have been very young at that time, but I had my own personal journey where I was like any other woman from a middle class background, coming from a educationally privileged background, but at the same time was facing abuse at home in marriage. So I don't know, I've not mentioned this anywhere, really, and it's not there in the book, but I had a very bad marriage for 16 long years. And of course, now I'm happily married, but that's one other person. But at that time, when I went to help in the relief camps, in the old city of Ahmedabad, and I saw very ordinary women, women who had dropped out of school at the level of 5th standard, 6th standard, women who didn't have any means to support themselves, women who came from very poor background. and who were sort of victims of the riots, and their homes were burnt down, and they were taking, shelter in that cemetery, which is called Kabristan, in the walled city area. And I was seeing how they were fighting for justice. How some of them were talking that, I want justice. I want to go to the parliament. I want to go to the Supreme Court demanding justice. So, somewhere a lot of interactions with these women who were survivors of riot at that time, it somewhere influenced me, it influenced my subconscious. And I felt that if ordinary women can have so much faith in their truth, and they can have so much faith in the democratic institutions such as parliament, such as court, then I, an educated woman, a woman who's teaching in a college, I have no reason to be in an abusive marriage. And something happened to me, and I decided that I don't want to be in that kind of a relationship. And I suddenly, that was like my moment of enlightenment. That was my moment of reckoning. And I felt that I should do something, for the community. I should do something for the women. I should give back. And that, after that, everything changed for me, and I was in a totally, different journey. So in brief, that was my moment of enlightenment. Yes, Divyanshu.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, on 18 June 2014, Muslim women made history by releasing a draft of an ideal Muslim personal law. You have also mentioned this in your book, and I would like to tell all the participants that this task was undertaken by Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan that went on a long journey of hundreds of consultations with Muslim women, lawyers, academicians, and other stakeholders. Ma'am, it will be very grateful of you if you could enlighten us more about this draft, what hardships you faced, and what solution were given to the issues which plague a Muslim woman today.
Yeah. So as many of you are law students, so you must be aware that in our country, we do not have a codified Muslim family law. We have the Hindu Code Bill laws. We have the Hindu Marriage Act, the Hindu Succession Act. The Parliament has also amended and reformed the Christian Marriage Act, whereby the Christian women are entitled to divorce as per the Indian Divorce Act. But it's because of the circumstances, because of the conservatism, because of the prevalence of orthodoxy and patriarchy, and also in our country, the prevalence of politics, because politics dominates everything in our country, unfortunately. So it's owing to all these multiple factors that the Muslim personal law did not get codified, and the law did not get passed by the Parliament of India. So it is shocking that we are still governed by the 1937 Shariat Application Act, which is like a Angrezon ka act, it was a British era act. And that act, so-called act, just says that we'll be governed by the Sharia, but it is silent on all the important matters concerning the lives of women and girls. For instance, that act does not say what will be the age of marriage. That act does not lay down the procedure for divorce. That act does not talk anything about polygamy, whether it is legal, illegal. It doesn't, give women share in property. Whereas, Quranically speaking, there are several rights which were granted to the women. So, we have heard this sentence being spoken very often, by the people from the personal law board and, the religious conservative male figures, that Islam gave rise to women 1400 years ago. But our argument is that, yes, it has been so, but have those rights translated into reality? So they cannot translate into reality because we are also a democracy, and we are also equal citizens in a democracy. We are entitled to the protection of law, a law that is passed by our own Indian Parliament. So we went to women and we asked the women, you were talking about, Divyanshu, you were talking about the draft of the Muslim family law that we put together by talking to women. Of course, we consulted experts and scholars and jurists and all those people, even religious scholars. We consulted all those people also. But the key stakeholders being the women, we in the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, we talked to thousands and thousands of women over a period of about 7 to 8 years. and it was really inspiring. It was really a more, like many moments, where we felt that these women are so strong. They know what is happening in their lives is wrong. They know that this is discrimination, this is injustice, and they also have the solution. So I'll just give you one example. There is this whole thing called polygamy, and the commonsensical understanding is that if you are a Muslim man, you are entitled to 4 wives. This is the commonsensical understanding. Of course, we don't agree with this understanding, because in Quran, everything has to be read as per the context. So the context of that time and the context today is very different. The sex ratios are very different. Plus, women are now very empowered. Girls are very empowered. They are not hapless being who need to be rescued, by a husband. So the context is very different. Plus, also very importantly, where there is a permission given for a second wife, it is never encouraged. It is always considered very bad to take a second wife without the permission of your first wife and without fulfilling the needs of your first wife. And even if you are able to fulfill these two conditions, you cannot equally provide love to both the wives. Therefore, marry only once. This is the verse which is given in the Quran. So in this consultation that we had on what kind of a Muslim family law we want, it was in Kolkata. And even a women had come from districts from Murshidabad, from Malda, all those places, very rural women. Again, like women who were, who had never gone to school, or even if they'd gone to school, they dropped out by 7, 8, 9 standard. Those kind of women had come. So we were discussing, we were just discussing, should there be should we just call for banning polygamy? Because some scholars were suggesting that keep it, but keep it very, very strict with strict conditions. So we were discussing this with the women. So, there was this murmur in one corner, 3, 4 women were continuously talking because they were speaking in Bengali, and we were like talking in Hindi, and then somebody was translating it in Bengali, and then it was, and that's how the women understood what was being discussed. So we asked, what's the matter? Why are these 3 women, not telling everybody what they're discussing? Then one young woman from there, she stood up and she says, ma'am, there should be no polygamy, full stop. Because if a man can have reasons to marry a second wife, a woman can also have several reasons, where a husband is not able to fulfill her needs and her requirements, or whatever, is she's supposed to fulfill in marriage. So we think that there should be only one man, one woman, one husband, one wife. And that day, no discussion on polygamy, conditionalities, because in any case, the Quran also urges us to apply our minds. It urges us to take into account the contextual realities. So it's certainly not, it is our firm belief that it is not permitted in today's circumstances, in today's context. So, I'm just giving one example of how we were able to put this law together. So like again, triple talaq. Lots of women said that it is nowhere there in the Quran, then why should it be permitted? So that was that simple, commonsensical logic, sort of not marred by any patriarchal mindsets or patriarchal considerations or political considerations. So yeah, just to give you an example of how we were able to put together this law over a period of so many years. And that law proposes a lot of affirmative actions. It builds on what is provided for in the Quran, and it also equally builds on what is provided by the Constitution of India, the principles of gender justice and gender equality. Yeah, Yanshi.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, as you have talked about age of marriage, so there is an article in your book that please let me marry after 18. This article also includes the consultation held at various places with Muslim men and women. Like, I was shocked to read the responses of men and women regarding the age of marriage. Some were of the view that what is wrong in marrying at 13, or some were okay with marrying at puberty. So why people are okay with marrying at an age when parties to the marriage are not socially, emotionally, and psychologically mature? What makes people support this? Like, do this have any backing of custom or religious text in Islam?
Yeah. Yeah, Divyanshu, again, this is also a very important discussion point. We have to keep in mind that large sections of Indian Muslims are poor and are extremely backward educationally and are extremely, deprived economically, socially. So there is very little opportunity even to read your text and understand your own religion. As a result, there is a lot of falling back on interpretations by, Maulvis who are 9 out of 10 times who are conservative, who are, who have their own, way of looking at things. They're interpreting, Quranic injunctions in their own understanding. So this commonsensical understanding that puberty is the age of marriage, again, that is not valid today. And again, the question is, what is the meaning of puberty? We are living in an era of internet, and we are living in an era of knowledge and information. What is the definition of puberty? First and foremost, it means emotional maturity. It means physical maturity. Marriage is an important social relationship. It means maturity to be able to take on enter into such an important social relationship. So you cannot say that the girl has started menstruating at 13, 14, or even 12 these days, So she has attained puberty so she can marry. So this is a very, very, I would say this is a very, very unacceptable kind of definition. And Divyanshu, you are right that, it is shocking that once in a while, there are people like that who insist that no, religion says puberty. But you, my dear sir, we always tell them, you have no understanding of religion. You have no understanding of women's rights, women's equality, forget that, but you don't have basic understanding of the religion also. So yeah, this is how it goes. So in our draft, Muslim family law draft, we want the age of marriage to be 18 and 21, and then there are the provisions of Child Marriage Act and, whatever is the law of the land. A lot of application of mind has happened on that. A lot of jurisprudence already exists. So we also want, that to. Over to you, Divyanshu.
Ma'am, like we are discussing here issues of women. So whenever I think about issues faced by women, then sexual harassment is the first issue that strikes my mind. And in an interview with Countercurrent, you said that there has to be a paradigm shift in societal attitudes where a woman speaking out against sexual harassment is heard and not vilified and demonized. So, how this paradigm shift will come and what role we as an individual can play and should play?
Yeah. Yeah. So, all of us are aware of how the entire Me Too movement happened, just a couple of years ago. It was very important that those women came out all over the globe and including in our country. They spoke about, what kind of harassment they are facing in their workplaces. But even as it was a very good development, it was only limited to us privileged women who were in, informal workspaces, women who were highly educated were the ones who were speaking out. So just imagine what must be happening to a woman who puts up a, cart by the roadside selling vegetables. What must be happening to the woman who is, somewhere on the railway platform selling, small kind of, chocolates or biscuits or those kind of items. So it's a very, very major issue because our constitution is talking about justice and equality. It's talking about women's right to work. It is also, our constitution is also enabling economic justice for women. But given the kind of society that we are a very, very male dominated society, and this applies to all places on the all over the world. It applies to the developed economies, it applies to developing countries, it applies to cities, it applies to villages, that we look at women in a certain way, left to ourselves. Because see, those of us who are, for instance, those of us who are participating in this webinar, or those of us who are studying in the law schools or any of the institutions of higher learning and education, we are amongst the very small percentage of privileged people. But the society at large remains extremely male dominated and patriarchal, and a woman's place as such is considered to be at home. So till we address that mindset, till we start educating at home and in school, we start educating our girls and our boys about, that a girl is as much entitled to all the facilities, all the amenities as a boy is. And the birth of a girl child should be as welcome as the birth of a boy child. No, beginning right there, beginning in our homes, beginning in the intimacy of our families, then going out in the communities, then going to the public spaces, then going to the workplaces. So that there has to be a mindset shift. It's a very positive development that we have this law beginning 2013 for prohibition of harassment, sexual harassment of women at workplace, and that law is being used by several women who are being harassed. But still, it's still very nascent. We're in nascent stages. But we need a lot of efforts on the part of the government, on the part of the society, on the part of community leaders, women leaders, teaching community, students, everybody, civil society, everybody, because we have to. We have to give this unfettered right to work to our daughters. And sexual harassment, because I am part of a internal complaints committee in ActionAid and in other places, and I can see how a woman who undergoes that kind of an experience, sometimes she can simply go back to the home and never come out again to work. So it can make or mar the life of a girl. So it's we need to undertake an all-round kind of a campaign towards education. And of course the law is there, but law also awareness, understanding of the law, and it's now becoming, it has been made mandatory to for all organizations to sort of implement this law. But like I said, that everything in our country has to be a beginning has to be made, and it will take its own time to seep in. Yeah, Divyanshu, back to you. Divyanshu, if I over speak and if I cross the time, you can always tell me, because I'll go on and on otherwise. I'm sorry.
No issues, ma'am. Ma'am, with your efforts, the ban on women entering the inner sanctum of Mumbai's Haji Ali Mosque is lifted. Now women are allowed to visit inner sanctum. But the trustees of Mumbai's Haji Ali Dargah said it would be a grievous sin to allow women come close to the tomb of a male saint. And one trustee of Haji Ali Dargah said that it is in Sharia law that no woman can visit a cemetery or a grave. Ma'am, don't you think that here the religion is misused? It is sheer patriarchy. You have also mentioned about ulema perpetuating male hegemony in the name of Islam in your book. So what barricades do you have to overcome during your journey for gender justice and equality in this patriarchal society?
Oh yeah, yes. It's several. As you can imagine, it has not been easy. Now when we sit and look back and all, it may appear like it just happened, but there have been many barriers, because like I said, patriarchy rules the roost in our society. And even these arguments by the trust, the Haji Ali Trust, they were just absurd arguments. So if it is not allowed by the Sharia, how come we have all gone right up to the sanctum sanctorum until 2012? So it's not as though the Sharia arrived and changed in 2012. So their logic is always very self-defeating, and it's not really a religion. It's a patriarchy masquerading as religion. We have seen it. We have seen it in Shani Shignapur temples. We have seen it in Haji Ali. We are seeing it in some temples also, other temples, and all masjids also. We are seeing it also in Christian places of worship. But the important thing is that India is changing, and the girls and women in India are changing, and even a lot of men and a lot of boys are also supporting, the girls and women who are, fighting for their rights and for equality. So that's a good development which has been taking place, particularly in the last 1 decade or so. And then a lot of women are coming forward to challenge the injustice. A lot of women are coming forward and, sort of going to the courts. Because when the community mechanism fails, then the women are forced to go to court. Because even in our case, in the Haji Ali matter, it's not as though we jumped into the Bombay High Court at the first go, no. We tried to dialogue with the trust. We went to the office of the trust First time they met us because they didn't know, what they were getting into this. So they just happened to meet us. After that, they never gave us any appointment, but we continued writing letters to them, which we had in our records. For 2 years, then we also wrote to the State Women's Commission, State Minorities Commission. They also tried to mediate, but the trust did not respond. And that's when we asked all our women members across different states that, this is what is happening, because Haji Ali is a place, not just Muslims go there, everybody goes there, because it's a Sufi dargah. So it's the I would say very humanist, liberal humanist face of Islam. So everybody goes there. Hindus go there, Muslims go there, women go there, men go there, Sikhs, everybody goes there, Christians, everybody goes there. That today they are barring the women. Tomorrow they will say nobody will come, only Muslims will come. Then second they will say only Sunni Muslims will come and Shia Muslims will come. So all these things were there. So when we talk to all the women, again, law making or legal action, and what is the wisdom of the women, that question. We talked to women across all the states, and the women said that we should try to resolve this matter through dialogue. But now that we have, tried to dialogue for the last 2 years, over 2 years, 2.5 years, but they are not paying us any heed, then we must take recourse of the land and we must take them to court. And luckily, I'm so happy to see that when we went to the Bombay High Court, they asked us, like you all know, being law students, why should we admit your petition? Tell us. And luckily, we have all those records, all the correspondence, all the letters that we had sent to them and they had rejected, they had not accepted. We had all the minutes or, the meetings which we had done, the Women's Commission, Minority Commission, and also the minutes of the meeting where the women were, sort of airing their views about what should be the next step. So we presented all those documents, and then the High Court realized, oh, these women are serious. It's not casual, it's not flimsy, it's not, it's not that kind of in a lighter vein kind of a thing. They are serious, they believe in justice, and they want to stand up for their rights. And that's when, they admitted the PIL. And that's how what happened after that is history. Of course, we won like with flying colors, basically.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, now as we are talking about ulema, so how the image of a ulema, or I can say a conservative religious male, as spokesperson of country's largest minority, has been hugely problematic for India's democracy. So what steps should be taken by government itself to protect the democracy?
Yeah, Divyanshu. So we are a democratic country, and we have our constitution. So all our values of justice, of equality, of fairness, of non-discrimination, including fairness in matters of gender justice, gender equality. Everything is enshrined in the constitution, and all the articles of the constitution they are very clear as to what should be the kind of laws, what should be the kind of practices, conduct which should be encouraged. And it's not for domination of any kind. It's not for domination of one individual over another. It's not for domination of community over individuals, and it's certainly not for male domination either. But unfortunately, we are still a very young democracy, and the kind of, we had a conflict-ridden history. Independence didn't come easy to us. We had India's partition, and everybody knows what happened, how it was a huge tragedy, and how, a lot of lives were lost. And, we were a country which was like ravaged and divided at that time. And then, but once the partition happened, then we are now a country defined by the Constitution of India. And we are a multi-faith, multicultural, multi-religious country. And we are citizens, equal citizens in our country, right? So this whole politics of pandering to certain conservative orthodox voices and then passing it off as the voice of the community is totally unacceptable. And that kind of politics has wreaked lot of havoc in our country. And the formation of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan happened, early 2007. Before our formation, the build up to our formation, the 3 years before that, when we were discussing again with women all over the country, this need was being felt that where is it written? Which religious book says that we have to be represented only by religious looking males? Why can't women, why can't girls, why can't youth, young men, why can't democratic minded, progressive minded individuals represent the country, represent the community? So that was the kind of discussions we had. And actually, one of the very clear cut goals of Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan is to build an alternative leadership of women and young men and women to build this kind of a progressive voice which participates in democracy, which demands rights and justice, but it also believes in fulfilling responsibilities as equal citizens in a democratic nation. So like we were taught in school, at school level, in civics class, the rights and duties are two sides of the same coin. So so we are trying, and if you look at the entire struggle for abolition of triple talaq, the ordinary Muslim woman has emerged as a spokesperson of the community, and the conservative male ulema, has lost credibility basically. So yeah, over to you, Divyanshu.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm now talking about Triple Talaq Bill. Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan played a very prominent role by vocaling the campaign against the practice of triple talaq, or I would say talaq-e-biddat, and it has welcomed the bill. But there are some Muslim feminist groups who were in favor of the abolition of talaq-e-biddat, but they are against the bill and signed petitions condemning the new law for setting punishments for husbands. So, ma'am, what is your stance on criminalizing this law?
Yeah, Divyanshu, this is also very important. Yeah, we like I said, we want the entire Muslim family law to be codified, and we want a clear-cut laws and guidelines on all aspects governing marriage and family. So we understand it doesn't happen so comprehensively at one go. So this is the a first step. It's a very welcome first step. So because without deterrence, a law is meaningless, and that's what is happening. Even though there is no sanction for instant triple talaq in the Quran, it is the commonest practice. As we found in our national study also, of the 525 women who were divorcee women out of the 5,000 odd women, out of these 525, more than 500 were divorced through the instant triple talaq method. So you ask the woman who gets affected. Yeah. So we welcome this law. Now, we were also requesting for certain amendments. Some of the amendments were accepted, some others were not accepted. Okay, I would have wished, and I'm sure many of us, or there are many others also have wished the same way. If there was more consultation, it would have been better. But my simple question is that when the woman was fighting against triple talaq, she was alone. There was no, all the big names and big scholars and all didn't come out openly and publicly. Not all of them came out. Some of them did come out, but not all of them. So now why is everybody so concerned about the men going to jail? And the experience is not at all of the men going to jail. We have found that it is very, very difficult to register an FIR also, because it's still a very, very new law. Rather than counseling the men not to indulge in this kind of inhuman practice. Why are you, sort of take the domestic violence law, take the POCSO law. There is jail term everywhere. So I don't know what is the problem in this particular instance. So yes, it is a civil matter. It is a civil matter, but then it is a civil matter. The violation in terms of the instant triple talaq enjoys so much sanction in the name of religion, because of the misinterpretation and falsification. So how because I good sense, it is not.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, like there is always an ongoing debate on reforms in personal law versus the Uniform Civil Code. So, what is your opinion on this debate on reforms in personal law versus the Uniform Civil Code?
Yeah. See, firstly, the Uniform Civil Code, it's more of a political debate. Let's accept the truth. It's not really driven by concerns of gender justice and gender equality. At least I am convinced that it's a political debate. Second, we don't know, when anybody is propounding a uniform civil code, what are the kind of issues, what are the kind of remedies that they have in mind? We don't know. We have no idea. And if you, as law students, all of you must be aware that the Law Commission of India, the latest Law Commission of India, came out with a report on the Uniform Civil Code, and they categorically said that it is not the need of the hour, and it's not going to fulfill the violation of women's rights, which is happening in the realm of marriage and family. So yeah, now in the recent, just a few days ago, a good ruling has come in the matter of property rights of a Hindu marriage for the woman. So that's a very welcome development. Similarly, there are. I'm not saying that the laws as they exist in the family matters are perfect, but I also feel that as of now, the whole discussion on uniform civil code is too much in thin air, and see, when it was originally taken up, when India became independent, and it ultimately found its expression in Article 44 of the Constitution. At that time, there was no Hindu Marriage Act or Hindu Code Bill was not there. At that time, the concern was gender justice, and the concern was that because of the patriarchy drawing ostensibly from religion in our various communities, Hindu communities, Muslim communities, Sikh, Parsi, Christian, everybody, all communities, because of the patriarchy prevalent conservatism, despite of the constitutional guarantees and constitutional principles, women may not get justice at home and in family. That was the concern. And that's how this, talk of a secular law came about. And that concern was very valid. And you, all of you, I'm sure, as law students will agree that that's a very, very genuine concern. But then following that concern, because at that time, this entire idea of uniform civil code was opposed. It was opposed by the right at that time. There were so many sadhus, so many religious organizations, so many, members of the Constituent Assembly. You take out the debates of the Constituent Assembly and read, they have, dwelt at great length on how a uniform civil code is a threat to our ancient civilization and our ancient culture and heritage. So that was the, we are talking about how many, 50, 60, 60, 70 years ago at the time of independence. That was the mindset at that time. It was extremely conservative, patriarchal in all communities. So uniform civil code idea was shelved. And you reforming the Hindu Marriage Act. You also reformed the Christian Act. The only area which was left out is the Muslim Family Act. So please, we urge the Parliament and we urge, everybody, all Indians, all citizens, all fellow citizens, that please support the campaign to codify Muslim family law, because that's the only way, there can be a semblance of justice for Muslim girls and Muslim women. Over to you, Divyanshu.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, इस भारतीय मुस्लिम महिला आंदोलन has formed औरतों की शरिया अदालत and Darul Uloom Niswa in order to provide legal support to Muslim women, to enable them to become qazis and to lead change in religious arena. So I wanted to know that how it is functioning and how decisions made by them are being implemented and how far is it successful in achieving its goal.
Yeah. So Divyanshu, what is happening is, like I said, in the absence of legal protection, We have a community mechanism which is valid, the alternative dispute resolution mechanism, which is there in our community. But the problem is that 99% of the time it's very, very male dominated. So they are sort of, guided by patriarchal interpretations. So as a result, they become very exclusionary places as far as the women are concerned. So like the women who used to be receiving instant triple talaq, they never got justice in the normal male Sharia courts, Darul Qaza or Imarat Sharia or numerous qazis who are there all over in rural and urban places, everywhere, all over the country. So, and it's also a problem of access of women, because women are not able to access these places because these are, like I said, they are male dominated spaces. So we thought that while we continue to educate the community, we continue to create awareness, that will be a very, very long-term goal and long-term and very, very, difficult task. Why not we start training women to be qazis? Because they are, and we give them a gender justice perspective based on the Quran and based on the Constitution and based on the principles of women's equality. So that's how this idea came, and we ended up, training a batch of 20 women, and all of them are, in their respective states. Across some 15 states, they are practicing, and they regularly receive matters, cases come to them, and we have our own entire, procedure of women's Sharia court. It's, we have tried to make it as progressive and we've also tried to adhere to the principles of natural justice. And even as we know that, it's a very unequal balance between the men and women. So it's working. And we had compiled data, not very recently, but up to 2 years ago. So more than, though I'm talking about 2016-17, more than 250 cases were resolved by us. And barring, I'm not exactly sure about the number, but barring some 12 to 14 were unresolved. And all the resolved ones were in the favor of women and were amicably accepted and implemented by both the parties. So yeah, so it has been a good experience. It has been a very positive experience of women helping themselves.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, what is model nikahnama that should be used by qazis, especially women qazi, and how you make sure that couples get married by using this nikahnama?
Yeah. So nikahnama is a very, very important legal document. But the irony is that normally, like we found in our study also, and it is a widely seen kind of a thing, that normally the nikahnama just contains the name of the bride and the groom and the names of the witnesses and the qazi's stamp and the qazi's letterhead. That's all. But we developed a nikahnama which is very, very, very elaborate. This nikahnama is based on the principles of the Quran, and it is a very, very gender affirmative document. So as per in our nikahnama, a woman has a right, and this is a Quranic right, to decide what kind of meher she wants. So like depending on the groom's earning capacity or depending on his socio-economic status, he is supposed to compulsorily give her meher at the time of the marriage, before consummating the marriage, actually. So we have put that in the nikahnama, and we have also suggested a minimum meher amount. It should be equivalent to his 1 year's earnings. We've suggested that because we have seen in our community, the meher is never given. It is meher maaf, or it is ridiculous amounts like 786 rupees. So it's a very, very affirmative provision which is diluted in practice. So we put that in the nikahnama. We also have in our nikahnama, we have the elaborate declaration by the groom that he does not have presently a wife. That if he was married, then either he is a widower or he's a divorcee, and he's supposed to provide evidence for that. And not only that, he's supposed to provide all the documents, his verification about himself, because invariably what happens, that the guy has come from some part of some village in some district in UP. He has come to work in Bombay or Delhi, and he has a wife and family back home in his village, but in Bombay he goes and marries afresh, And at the time of marriage, he doesn't tell this girl and her family that he's already married. And after marrying him in a month or 2 or 6 months down the line, she learns that he already has a family back home. So we have done that whole trail of documents and trail of verification. There are witnesses. There are a lot of legal provisions we have kept in the Nikahnaama. And of course, we need to popularize it much, much, much more. It's no use if it's lying on our website, or it's no use only if those people who come to our meetings and are in the know use that Nikahnaama. It should be used by more and more people. So yeah, it's a very, very important legal document, because even the courts hold the Nikahnaama as valid, because it's like a contract between, in Muslim marriage is a contract between two, it's a social contract between two parties. So this is the legal instrument, the Nikahnaama.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, if there is a separate article on Dr. Ashtar Ali, engineer, who has played an important role in framing of model Nikahnaama, so it would be very kind of you if you could tell us about such a renowned scholar and his feministic interpretation of Quran and your working experience with him.
Yeah, so Asghar Ali, that article was written as part of a commemorative edition which was brought out. As we all know, he left us. He passed away some 5-6 years ago. So yeah, so that article was written as a tribute to him. He was, I would say, a truly feminist Islamic scholar, a truly humanist Islamic scholar who believed in gender justice, and who believed who believed every living movement. He worked for women's equality, and he was a pioneer in India. Early on, he started interpretations which were, gender just, and he linked the Quran and the Constitution, and he faced a lot of onslaught from within his community. He took a lot of risk. There was attempts on his life also, both in India and when he was traveling in Cairo. For me, he was like my guide, in some ways, like my very dear friend, my elder, my mentor. I looked up to him, and I spent a few years, like we were very dear friends, and he was like a father figure for me. And his void is deeply felt. But he has made a major contribution to the entire arena of rights of women in Islam. And his writings have spread so much awareness and understanding. And he has been a very avid kind of I would say, writer, trainer, everything. He would go, like I would call him and I would, tell him that in some remote part of Bihar or some remote place in Rajasthan, we are organizing a workshop. 50 women are coming. If you can spare time, he was always ready. Even I mean, when he was, unfortunately, when he was in his last moments also, I had a few very elaborate phone calls with him. And he just said, it's so sad that he said, "Kid, don't go." We had plans together. So even from his kind of deathbed, he said, "Don't go ahead. I'll be back, and then we'll pursue it together." But unfortunately, yes, he left us. So that was a huge loss personally for me and for all of us who believe in gender justice and women's equality. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, like India is a very young nation. According to 2011 census, 34.38% of Indian population comprises of youth. So what message do you want to give to our youth, as they are our future and has an important role to play in Rashtra Nirman?
Yeah, exactly. We are actually, it depends, the future of our nation, the future of, we as a people, we as people of of the Indian subcontinent, the entire future depends on our youth. And what will happen in our country will, in a way, decide the democratic discourse globally also, because we have so much to offer. We have so much to offer, civilizationally speaking, culturally speaking, because we are a society full of diversity, full of we have so many languages, We have all the religions of the world in our country. Yeah, we have all the languages of the world. We have all people of all backgrounds, all faiths, all cultures, and within our country also there is so much diversity, and we all live together peacefully. We all live together by and large in harmony. We have all been. I don't like to use the word tolerance, but we have all lived, with respect towards the other people from other faith backgrounds. So that's how we have lived. So the youth can really, as they say in Hindi, there's a lot of daromadar on the youth as to what direction our democracy today will take, and what impact it will have, on the entire world. So, and particularly, young people like yourselves who have the privilege of, being in educational institutions, higher learning institutions. You have a lot. There's a lot I'm sure, and Think India is also part of one such initiative. I'm aware because earlier also I have participated in Think India programs. So so people like people like you have a lot of responsibility on your shoulders, that we want to save the plural democratic fabric, not only save the fabric, but we want to multiply it much more, many more times. So such that it becomes a country becomes a place where everybody is happy, where nobody is deprived, where everybody can live a life of dignity, So yeah, so that expectation, my generation, I don't know how much, whatever little, and we are all people on the way out. You are the people, who have your whole lives in front of you. So yeah, a lot depends on you.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, as Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Mandal was established in 2007 and now it has been 13 years. So, what changes have you observed in Muslim women in this span of 13 years? Is it the rise of new Indian Muslim women?
Yes, I can say that with a degree of satisfaction that the Muslim woman and the Muslim girl is changing, and she is changing for the better. And of course, we have a long way to go. I'm sure that eventually this change will lead to a change in the entire community and in the entire country. More and more girls are becoming aware of their rights. More and more girls are becoming aware of concepts like justice, equality, justice at home, justice in society, justice in public spaces. So it's a change for the better. More and more girls are educating themselves. More and more girls are going out to work, and more parents, that includes the father and mother both, are wanting to educate their children, and particularly girls. So that's a good sign. And actually, the whole movement against triple talaq, was a movement created and sustained by ordinary Muslim women. So that's amongst so many movements which happened in the recent past. One of the very prominent movement of women in our country, and even globally, it was the movement to abolish triple talaq. So that was led by Muslim women. And then they went on also, the protests that we have seen against the Citizenship Amendment Act. So it was the leadership qualities which, came to the fore. And this idea of justice and equality, this faith in the Constitution of India and faith in democracy, and, wanting to be participating in democratic processes. Because as a whole, like I said, our community is given to a lot of control by the conservative factors, and there has been a lack of democratization and participation in democratic processes on a large scale compared to other marginalized communities. But that is now slowly beginning to change. So yeah, it's definitely a change for the better. I've seen that. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, now we have some questions in chat box from the attendees. So, if you allow, may I take those questions?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, first question is from Abhilasha Tiwari. Ma'am, please put some light on education area given in Quran for women and men distinguished.
Actually, actually, there are so many verses in the Quran. where Allah directly addresses men and women together, you know, and that includes right to education, that includes right to work, that includes right to mobility, that includes right to create institutions, that includes right to build property and have a share in property. So Quran does not distinguish between a girl and a boy when it comes to education. So if we have seen any discrimination, that is because of the misinterpretation, deliberate or based on ignorance. But yes, so it totally supports girls' education, and we believe that girls should educate themselves and empower themselves. That's the only way.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, next question is from Mansi Batra. UCC is now the need of the hour. UCC is now the need of the hour. So, what is your say on that?
See, ideally, personally, I would like all other laws, we are governed by secular laws. Religion has no role in our laws. Like you take any law, like you take 302, 307, 125 CR, so all these are laws applicable to all. So ideally, I prefer that there should be a law, in matters of marriage and family, we should equally apply to all Indian citizens, full stop. But personally, but we have to take account of the kind of society that we are in India. And I'm not just talking about the Muslim community here, I'm talking about all communities. And I think there is greater wisdom in the, what some of the legal luminaries have said. And also, like I said, the report of the Law Commission of India. Maybe that time will come. It will come, when some of you young girls who are students now, when you will become mothers, maybe that time, because that time should come where our girls stand up and say, injustice, don't justify it in the name of religion. It can be injustice in every community. I'm not saying because there is Hindu Marriage Act, it doesn't mean that there is no injustice happening to Hindu girls. It's happening. So we need that kind of a society. We need to build that kind of a society and that kind of equality and empowerment for our girls, where they are able to distinguish between what is patriarchy and what is injustice. So, and in any case, we do have the Special Marriages Act. I married under the Special Marriages Act, which already exists, where anybody from all faith background can go and marry. So I also feel that the Special Marriage Act needs to be amended. It needs to be strengthened. It needs to be made more comprehensive. It needs to be popularized by the government and by all of us. So in a way, a secular law, you call it uniform code or whatever, it already exists in the form of the Special Marriages Act. Yeah. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Yogesh More. He's asking that what kind of reforms do you think will be faced as a major challenge in terms of theocratic resistance? What can be done to neutralize patriarchal approach by means of constitutional and jurisdictional amendment?
Yeah. This is very important because there will be and there was resistance even in the triple talaq matter. So if you're law students, if you read the affidavits, some of the affidavits filed by the Personal Law Board, it's shocking. It's shocking and it's ludicrous, the kind of arguments that they are given. So this resistance will always be there. But that's why, we have to break this hegemony of knowledge by the male religious figures, because religious knowledge is not the prerogative or sole domain of male religious figures. Religious knowledge can be acquired by ordinary mortals, men or women, girls or boys. So that's what we are trying to break. We are trying to, and then we are also part of some global movements, like the movement Musawa, which is a global movement for gender justice and in the Muslim family law. So we're trying to draw from these movements and those scholars also, and we are trying to interpret the law ourselves, so that we don't have to fall back on those conservative patriarchal misinterpretations. So yeah, but I agree that it is never going to be easy. It will always be a resistance, and it will be a continuous battle. But our democratic institutions and our constitutional provisions empower us and equip us to continue this battle, and that's what we're trying to do. Over to you, Divyanshu.
Thank you, ma'am. And now I'll be reading the last question, and it is from Srinath Shinde. Ma'am, as you talked about the contextual interpretation of Quran in that perspective, what do you think? What is the role of school of Jamaat or madrasa in contextual interpretation of Quran? And what are other ways to come out with the contextual interpretation of Quran?
Yeah. See, madrasa, if we make, as per my interpretation, if I make my own, if I'm allowed to make a definition, madrasa is nothing but a place of learning, a school. So, and also in our study, we found that majority of Muslim parents want to send their children to school and not to madrasa. They're very clear, they want to send their children, girls and boys, to madrasa only for religious learning, not for maths, physics, science, English, Gujarati, Marathi, not for those subjects. So it's just a place of learning, nothing more. But if we take the true spirit, of the context provision, then in today's time, we need more and more schools, we need more and more colleges, we need more and more universities, we need more and more institutions of higher learning. That would be a madrasa. So that is my interpretation. And Jamaats are like, like we have caste panchayats, like in all communities, we different communities, like I know where I belong to Gujarat, but I know all my friends, they have their own caste panchayat. So Jamaat is just that much and nothing more. So it enjoys a social sanction if you want, but if you don't want, if you are a very aware individual, if you are aware of your rights, of the laws of the land, then you need not go into that kind of a Jamaat or a caste panchayat. So the same as that. So no more validity other than this social kind of a thing. Yeah, Divyanshu, over to you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a pleasure talking to you. Now I'll hand over this to Shivani, ma'am.
I deem it is great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks for this great event on the behalf of my team. First and foremost, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for Zakia ma'am. It was a pleasure to listen to your insights and perspective on the subject matter. We appreciate you taking time out from your busy schedule to share your thoughts with all our attendees. We also sincerely look forward to having you on board for guiding us, mentoring our Karyakartas, and participating in our future initiatives. I must thank to Ms. Divyanshu for hosting today's discussion so well and for her insightful questions. We are also grateful to our organization Think India and all the members to make this event last. But most importantly, I must thank our attendees. I thank you all for your participation. It's audiences like you that make the event successful. Once again, thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Think India. Thank you, all the friends, Ajay, Shiva, Aditya, Shivani, Divyanshu, and all friends of Think India. I hope I was able to throw some light on some of the issues, and I hope I didn't bore you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.